Welcome back to lecture. Today we are going to be talking about observations and self-report measures. You'll remember from previous lectures that we talked about three ways to measure behavior: through observation, watching people; physiological, measuring those normal bodily responses; or through self-report, where people can say what they're feeling and tell you about their experiences. Today we're just going to focus on the two, observation and self-report, leaving physiological for another time. An observational method is any time that you are measuring actual behavior. So not getting at those internal beliefs, but actually the externalization of some kind of thought. So it manifests as a behavior that we can observe. And when we are doing observational measures, we should be keeping three general questions in mind. The first is, where are we observing someone? Is it in a natural or a not necessarily natural environment? Does the participant know that they are being observed? And then how are we actually recording and or analyzing that observed behavior? The first question is, where do we observe our participants? And one way of doing this is through naturalistic observation, which is just observing in a natural situation. There is no intrusion, no kind of manipulation from the researcher. It's just watching people being people. For instance, you might be a play researcher who goes out to a playground and observes how children are interacting with each other. What tools are they using? How are they engaging their bodies? How interactive are they with other individuals? There's lots you can observe without the child, being manipulated or being affected in any way, just watching. And you can do this from a distance, or you could do what's called participant observation, which is when you kind of get mainly involved in what's going on. You are becoming part of that world. So in this instance, it would be if the researcher went on to the playground and helped to work with the children or show them new tools and see how they interacted with different equipment on the playground. This has also been done famously by the chimpanzee researcher Jane Goodall, who went into the environment with these chimpanzees to understand how they had social interaction with each other, to really understand them, not just observing from a distance. We also have a famous case where researchers went in to join a doomsday cult that said the Judgment Day is in 2011. And they wrote about their experiences being in the cult. What was it like to have all of the participants constantly believing that there was a judgment day coming? And then, more interesting, what happened when that date came and passed? How did the members of this religious group kind of deal with that outcome that didn't meet their expectations? Wrote a really cool book about it, When Prophecy Fails. But this was observations that you couldn't get from being on the outside. Anybody talking to these cult members or trying to watch the chimpanzees from a distance probably wouldn't get the same level of information as if they were actually engaged, becoming active participants in the environment. So that is one variant on the naturalistic observation. Now, if you don't want to do something natural, which is just kind of watching from distant or just watching the natural behavior occur, you want to start manipulating things a little bit. This is when you get the contrived observations. This is where you're getting a research setting to observe. You're creating an environment that is conducive towards what you are trying to observe or record. So you're specifically putting out certain toys for the kids to play with, or you're asking them to get into a couple to get into an argument so you can see how they deal with conflict. And this is usually thought to be synonymous with a laboratory, because a laboratory has a lot of power in the part of the researcher to control the environment, but it doesn't have to be. We can set up natural environments the way we want them to, put out certain toys, put out certain stimuli into the environment that we are intentionally hoping that the individual will interact with, that wouldn't have normally been there. Anytime you're introducing something that isn't normally there, that isn't natural to that environment, that is specifically for the purposes of your research, that is going to be a contrived observation. The second question we have is, does the participant know that they are being observed? So one way you could do it is the undisguised observation, where the participant really knows, okay, I'm being watched. I'm a kid on a playground and there's a researcher right there, or I'm being asked to get into a spat with my spouse. I know that I'm being recorded on how I deal with this conflict. They are being observed and aware of it. Now, Can be good because there's no ethical issues of, oh, I didn't know I was being recorded in this, but it can lead to what's called reactivity, where a participant changes their behavior when they know someone is watching. So they might act normally if they weren't being observed, if they didn't know they were being observed, but as soon as we point the lens on them, they start to act differently. And this can go in different ways. One, it could turn out that the individual kind of becomes more controlled, kind of hides the way they would naturally engage in a behavior. So if you are filming relationships in conflict, maybe you'll see people be a little bit more active listeners, trying to showcase, I'm a good partner, so I'm not going to just kind of fly off the rails and stonewall my partner. I'm going to engage in this conflict a little bit more than I normally would. Or we might find the other way where they get more bombastic, more energetic because they think, okay, I'm being observed by the researcher. I need to give something to the researcher. I need to make them feel like this was worth it. So I'm going to go all out and maybe do stuff I wouldn't normally do so that it's more interesting. I'm interesting in this study. So we don't know which way it's going to go, though. And that's going to be a confound we're going to talk about in another week with the sampling and how people are responding to experimental manipulations. But it's something to consider when we are undisguised. Oh, if we are worried about reactivity, then maybe we can get disguised. Here we have a disguised observation where the participant doesn't know they're being observed. And this is okay ethically as long as the behavior is entirely public. It's not appropriate to observe a participant without them knowing if they are doing something private that they have not said it's okay to observe. And as soon as you ask them, can I observe you, then it's going to be this undisguised observation. So all of these need to be in public environments with public behavior. But how do we find a compromise between these two options? Because if we're undisguised, the participant will react, but if we're disguised, then we can't get to all of these naturally occurring scenarios. We can't actually see a lot of behaviors that wouldn't be public, that would most likely be private. And a lot of what humans do is private. So what is the compromise here? One way is through what's known as partial concealment. Partial concealment is when they know they're being observed, so it's technically an undisguised, but they don't know what is being observed. So they can't react appropriately to the variable they think. So if you say, I'm studying conflict, they might be more conflicting or less conflicting. But if you don't tell them necessarily, oh, we just want your spouse to come in here and you're just going to talk about something, you can give, and you can be a little bit more conniving, more strategic about what you tell the participant you are studying, so it throws them off the scent of what you're actually observing, so they can't react directly to it. You also can do knowledgeable informants. This is when you have people who know about the naturally occurring behavior and can tell you about it. So you have friends, families, coworkers, and they might be able to observe and tell you about the private behavior. So there's not quite the same ethical issues because it is being observed by someone that is kind of signed on to this observation. And finally, you could do some form of unobtrusive measurement where the participant is not aware of the study, but you're still getting data from them. So this is usually forms of data collection where you're kind of following behind the trail of someone's behavior and identifying what they're doing. So you might be collecting bottles to see what they've ingested, or how many cigarette butts do they have, so you can see how often they smoke. Just kind of things that they have left in public spheres. Maybe you didn't witness them actually smoking or actually drinking a lot of alcohol, but you can still measure it in some way. The final question when it comes to observational data is, how do we collect and analyze? And there's 4 different approaches. The first is a narrative approach where you are just describing the behavior. So this play-by-play, what happened, X happened, then Y happened, then Z happened, what led between the two, the progression. So writing it all down. You can also do checklists, which is just the frequency of a specific behavior. You're looking for how many times someone hugged or played with a toy or used a certain word in conversation. You can also do temporal measures, which is anything doing with timing. So it could be duration or latency. I'll go into a little bit more explanation. As well as rating scales, where you have the observer making subjective judgments about a behavior. Not the actual self-report from the individual, but a report from the observer. So a little bit more detail, narratives. These are always written or typed out descriptions of the participant behavior, very detailed. And these can be unstructured and open-ended. So that means there's no really form or format. It's just write down what you see. Don't check yes, no to something. Don't have a bulleted list. Don't have a checklist, which we'll go into next, of behaviors. Just open-ended, write down everything you see. Now, this could also come from audio or video recordings, so maybe you're not there in the moment to collect the data. Maybe you're only doing audio versions of an interaction, and then you can go back and transcribe or note certain words. I've done plenty of studies where we are recording people talking about a specific stressful experience and trying to find out how many times they use coping strategies in it. For instance, I did a study where we analyzed women who were hearing from their doctor about whether they had breast cancer and how they talked to the doctors. What kind of words did they use to describe the stress they were feeling, how they wanted to share this information with their family members. And we were looking for certain keywords that they were using. Now you can summarize this or you could do it verbatim. It's really up to how the researcher is doing it. Again, verbatim is this is exactly what happens versus summary is a shorthand version, a little bit quicker field notes. This is not a transcription, whereas verbatim would be a transcribed interaction. And this is always going to be qualitative. Remember we talked about qualitative is the kind of quality of an interaction. It's describing it, whereas quantitative is turning it into numbers. With a narrative, it is always the quality focused. And then later, if you wanted to, you could analyze it by adding some checklists or something to identify the frequency of different phrases or content that's there. I've mentioned already, but now we can talk about checklists, which are the opposite of a narrative, where they are more structured and predetermined. There is a very clear format to them. It is checking the number of times that a behavior happens, the frequency. For instance, we have the observational scale of distress, the OBSD, where observers watch a participant and are checking all of the ways that the person is acting. How many times did they engage in interaction where they were alert or prejudiced or quiet? And the frequency of these different behaviors will help to convey whether or not the participant is experiencing distress based on the stimuli or during an interaction. Now, if you are using something like this, like alert and prejudice and quiet, and you're trying to check it, well, you need to really know what all of those things mean. Now, it's one thing when it's saying, how many times did they blink? And you can say, okay, well, I kind of know what a blink is, but what does it mean to be alert? Or even, what does it mean to hit? How hard does the hit have to be, or a kick? Or how long does eye contact have to be engaged for it to count as making sustained eye contact? What is defensive? What is the body language associated with it? So here, these operational definitions that we've talked about many times throughout this course so far are extremely important. Every observer needs to know exactly what is meant by each behavior so that they have a very clear threshold to say, yes, it was that behavior, or no, it wasn't. There's no, oh, okay, they were 1.5 alerts or 1.25. I don't know. They were definitely alert one time, but only kind of alert another one. You have to have a line in the sand so that you can check it off and say, yes, it was alert. If you want to get into more hard data kind of observations, you could start using temporal measures. And these can go by duration or latency. So duration is any kind of space that it takes to complete a task or how long a behavior is engaged in. So we might have, it took 10 minutes to solve a puzzle, or these two couples were kissing for 4.5 seconds. This is very descriptive, but you still need to know when did the behavior start and when did it end? When does the kiss really begin? That operational definition of what was the kiss. Is a quick peck, does that count? What do you need more of? And when do they really start the puzzle? And how do you deal with breaks in the process? Those kind of operational definitions are important. The same thing goes for latency, where you're measuring the time between when a stimulus begins and there is a response. So this can be reaction time, which is a quick bodily response to something, or there can be decision delay, which is a type of reaction time where something is seen and it needs to be processed in the mind and a decision needs to be made about how to react to that stimulus. So reaction time is more like, okay, you get hit by a hammer on your knee, how long does it take for your knee to respond? Or you see a flash of light on a screen, how long does it take you to click a key saying, yeah, I saw that flash? Whereas a decision delay is more, you see something like maybe there's smoke coming out of a vent in the floor, and you're trying to decide how long until I stand up and go get the researcher to say, hey, maybe there's an issue in this room and we should not be taking a study in here. That's based on a classic study of bystander effect. How will having other people around cause this decision delay to increase, where it takes longer to see an incident and then report it? A classic example of the response delay used in observational research is the implicit association task, or the IAT. This method has received a lot of controversy over the past couple of decades, and what it is intended to do originally is show potential associations between variables and see how quickly an individual kind of subconsciously responds to that association. Is it a quick response, which signifies that it is already pre-structured into the brain, that it's an easy association to make? Whereas if there's a long response delay where the individual is taking a moment to say, that association doesn't make sense, I need to really think through it, then it means that there is a subconscious or implicit lack of association between two things. So this is most classically used in a study of associations between white and black-skinned individuals versus bad or good qualities. So you might show a single face, and on the left you would have white or bad, and you click a key to signify left, and on the right you have black or good. So when it flashes up, you click left or right, and the speed with which you can identify it as white or bad, that association between the image and the white or bad and the image or the black or good, suggests whether you have an implicit association that white is connected to bad and black is connected to good. When we switch it up, though, in the other slide, where black or bad is the association and white or good is the association, are the participants quicker to make that association? With the idea being that if you are quicker to respond to an association between the black is bad and white is good, it shows some kind of racial bias. This is commonly applied in many different situations to investigate biases. This can be done with racial groups, gender, sexuality, age, religion. I've seen it done with associations with body weight, self-esteem. It can be used in a lot of different scenarios, but of course it gets a lot of controversy because the millisecond difference between these responses, is that really enough to identify someone as being biased or not? Is the social subconscious structures that might be in around us that might lead to that subconscious assessment? There's a lot of controversy about what does it really mean. But it's a really interesting study, something, if you haven't heard of the IAT before, there's a lot of tools out there online that you could take it and find out, if you or maybe have any subconscious bias towards any specific associations. It's always an interesting kind of self-revelatory process. All right, but let's move on to the fourth one, which is observational rating scales. This is when you're kind of filling out a report about the behavior, whereas the narrative is this open-ended, very unstructured, and the checklist is extremely structured. Just check the number of times this happened, yay or nay. This one has a kind of how much of something is occurring. Is the behavior not ever occurring, or is it always occurring? Is it a very strong reaction or a weak reaction? And you are selecting as the researcher where on this spectrum that behavior falls. But you already see on the screen, and you might have guessed yourself, there is a significant amount of subjectivity in this scale. When you have a strict operational definition of a behavior, yay or nay, there is less subjectivity because you've described it so well. But it's really hard to add operational definitions to what is a moderate amount of a behavior, or what is a 6 out of 7 on the scale versus a 7 out of 7 on the scale. It really comes down to the rater. And this is when we need that inter-rater reliability that we talked about when we talked about our section on reliability. where we have multiple judges, multiple raters who are all observing the same behavior and writing on this scale how much and what the intensity of the behavior is. So you can merge it all together, aggregate it, and get a more reliable, or at least see if you have a reliable understanding of the behavior. If your inter-rater reliability is really low, it signifies that there is something very unclear about rating the behavior. The intensity of it doesn't really convey well. So when people are crying, is that a loud cry, a soft cry? When they're shouting at each other, well, one rater might come from a family that's used to a lot of very loud expressions of emotions, whereas another rater might come from a very quiet family that kind of doesn't really ever talk about how they're feeling, and so there's never a lot of conflict. And so seeing the same kind of arguing or seeing the same amount of crying might feel extreme to one group, whereas just kind of normal run-of-the-mill to another rater. So you want to use multiple raters who come from different backgrounds, different experiences to inter-rater reliability to rate your observations. Now, this is also a good segue into what are known as observer effects, and this is how the individual rater's biases might actually hurt the validity of a observational measure. That the researcher has opinions and beliefs and experiences about life and thought, and they come from different backgrounds with loud families versus quiet families, and that bias can bleed into these observations. One, it can influence their interpretation of the participant's behavior. For instance, maybe they just got into a really great relationship with another person. Maybe they just got married, and so they're watching this conflict and they're just thinking positive things. They're going to work through this. It's going to be great. But it could also go the other direction, where the individual has just come from a really bad breakup. Maybe they've experienced divorce, and so watching a couple fight, they think, it's all going to fail. It's all going to fall apart. This is a terrible conversation, and this couple isn't going to make it. So there's a lot of bias that can come in. And so researchers need to be very careful that they're recognizing their own situation and trying to be objective about the participant's situation, the participant's behavior. Another form of observer effects is the observer expectancy effect. This is when the observer thinks something is going to happen or expects some kind of outcome from the behavior, or expects to find something in the research. They're really excited about their hypothesis that couples who go through a certain manipulation are going to get divorced or have more tumultuous relationships. And so this expectation can really influence how the participant is observed and influence the participant themselves, especially if the observer is engaged, is interacting with the participant in any way. Just being watched and the observer kind of looking for things and maybe cueing things can change a participant's behavior through this reactivity as well. So it can go both ways. The observer can be biased and the observer can affect the participant. So we have to be very careful. And so one of the ways we get around this is we make sure the observer doesn't necessarily know what the hypothesis is going to be. They don't have something to be excited about. And we make sure that they are trained and don't have some major bias incident happening to them that could affect the data. Kind of researchers need to be trained to come into it with very objective mindsets. All right, so as a review of this quick section about observational methods, you're observing the actual behaviors, again, not those thoughts or feelings, which we'll get into in a minute with self-report. And you have these decisions to make of whether it should be a natural or contrived locale for your observations. Does the participant know? Is it obtrusive or unobtrusive? And how are you recording and analyzing through the narratives checklist, the time measures, or the rating scales? And throughout all of it, you need to be very careful with the observational methods that you are taking into account the observational bias that the researchers are bringing in, and you are setting up clear operational definitions where necessary. All right, so we've covered observation. Now it's time to cover self-report. Self-report measures are any kind of assessment or measure where you are getting the participant to evaluate their own thoughts, feelings, behaviors, tell you about what they've been doing, how they've been feeling, what they've been thinking. And so to do this, we have to write questions that are very well worded to get at what we want to hear from them, what we're actually evaluating. Because participants could interpret our questions in any way. Maybe they don't want to share, maybe they don't understand the question you're asking them. So there's a lot of small decisions that go into how do we develop these self-report measures, and that is the topic of this section. Now, as a running example throughout this, I am going to use this example. Imagine you are a researcher interested in attitudes about legalizing marijuana. Yes, we cannabis. So this is a topic that's been very hot over the past decade of should it be legalized, should it not? But you are a researcher who wants to know, how do people feel about it in different states, different environments, different backgrounds? So you want to develop self-report measures where people can tell you their thoughts. And we're going to look at a number of different ways that you can ask this question. One way of formatting a self-report question is through what's known as open-ended questions. This is where you ask a very open-ended generic question where the respondent can answer you in any way that they really want. So you might say, tell us about your views on legalizing marijuana. This opens the door to the participant to say anything they want about the process, about the ramifications of it, about their past history or experience with it, whether they've imagined scenarios where it has been legal or where it hasn't. They could talk about anything and everything here, very open to the participant. There's no cap to how much they can say either, which is another aspect of the open-ended, that the participant can go on for as long as they are allowed. They can say one sentence, one word, fine, or they could say paragraphs and paragraphs, and they could talk for a substantial amount of time about their views, and you are just recording it all. The primary advantage to this is that people can tell about what's important to them, whether they've thought of it or not, just its stream of consciousness, whether they'd ever thought about legalizing marijuana at all. Well, now they have an opportunity to think about it in the process of answering your question. So you get a lot of depth here into what the individual is thinking, or potentially a lot of depth. However, in that depth, you might get a lot of information that you don't care about. So they're talking about legalizing marijuana, and they go on some tangent talking about their college roommate who had X or Y interaction with marijuana that was positive or negative, and then they go on talking about their family or maybe their religious background and why it's okay or not. A lot of that may be interesting or may not be interesting to your study or to the hypothesis that you have. So there's a lot of chaff that has to be weeded through. It's also very challenging to review all of that information. You've collected this data with all of these responses that could be a lot of data. Well, how do you filter through it? How do you take this information and whittle it down to usable data for any kind of qualitative or even quantitative analysis that you're doing? So not only is it time consuming on the analysis, but it's also time consuming just to collect. You have to wait for participants to actually share this, particularly if you're doing some kind of interview version of self-report where you are giving the person time to talk. You then have to sit there with them while they talk about all of their views. If you don't have that kind of time, well, then you can go to a close-ended question. This is where you have specific things that you are looking for, and the participant has to respond within the bounds that you have provided them. You have specific dimensions of interest, and the participant can't go beyond those. So we have to be very careful about what we set as the dimensions. What are the boundaries that we are asking the participant to respond to? It has to be enough that the participant can voice their opinion, can share their perspective, their thoughts, behaviors, that it's actually being collected, while not overdoing it by collecting too much that you don't need or taking too long in the process. So there's a bunch of different ways that you can design a close-ended question. The first is a forced choice, where you might ask a yes or no question, or say, like, pick one of the following. Are you in favor of it? Super in favor, super not in favor. And if you only have two options, this is known as a dichotomous format. Dichotomous just means two of them. You're choosing between two. But you can have forced choice where there are multiple levels that they can choose from. And this gets towards what's known as a Likert scale, also pronounced Likert scale. So you might say, I want you to tell me how much you agree or disagree on a certain question. And this usually ranges about 5 to 7 scale points from the strongly disagree to strongly agree, or it never happens to it's extremely frequently. You want the anchors on either end. That's what those endpoints are known as, the anchors. The anchors on either end represent the extremes, and the individual can choose where they lay on that extreme. So it's a semi-forced choice in that they have to choose one of the levels, but each of the levels is kind of systematically different, an interval scale where they can kind of decide how they sit on it, instead of just yes, I agree versus no, I don't agree, that dichotomous format. There's also what's known as semantic differential scales. So this is when you're still putting the extremes, and they have to kind of choose which word makes more sense to them or fits their opinion more. So legalizing marijuana is, well, okay, I'll lean towards wise, or I'll lean towards foolish. Instead of promoting it as that Likert scale where it's agreement on a specific question, here it's what association do you have with these words and the stimuli that's being presented. And then finally, you could have a multiple choice where you're just saying checklist, which of these do you think is good? And you can have a bunch of options on there, and marijuana could be one of them. So you could design this in any way, and you're just trying to see how frequently does a participant kind of agree with and check off one of your options. In addition to the general layout of the questions, you also want to think about how you write it. How are you most clearly telling the participant what you are trying to assess so that they can respond appropriately? So you want to write simple and clear questions. For instance, you could put the question, what kind of drugs do you take? But this might not be as clear as you think it is, because a participant might think, oh, are you talking about prescription drugs? Are you thinking about non-prescriptive drugs? Where does what I'm doing and how often do I take them fall into this question? You also want to think about the wording, whether it's simple enough. So the self-relevant affect on the following scale is a jargon that the participant might get a little confused or maybe even a little defensive about if they think, oh, so high-minded. So you just say, rate how you feel about yourself on the following scale. But even that, the feel about yourself could lead to different interpretations. So you really want to be careful how you're wording in the best way possible. One way to get around this is to, or not to get around, but to think about this, is to get other people who are from the population you're trying to assess to kind of look at your question and tell you if it makes sense to them. You also want to keep your reading level appropriate. So how muddled do you feel on a scale of 1 to 10? Well, does the participant know what muddled means? Maybe they do, maybe they don't. If you're unsure, then it's probably not the appropriate level. Now, again, you could get someone from the population that you are going to assess to kind of try out or pre-test your study, and they can tell you if they feel that it was clear and appropriate. And then finally, you want to avoid making any assumptions about the respondent, that they have a certain level of knowledge. So how do you feel about Canada's healthcare plan? Well, maybe they've never heard of it. This could be something that you're really interested in knowing about, but they don't know it. So sometimes you want to give them a little bit of details or ask them different questions that can triangulate from your kind of presupposed understanding of your respondent's population. Be careful about not asking questions that are just your interests that you think are so exciting to you that they may or may not have any knowledge of. There are also a few ways to write questions that we want to be very intentional about avoiding because they can lead to bias. So one of those is a loaded question. This is when you have a question containing a controversial assumption and it assumes that the participant is going to answer in a certain way. So you could maybe ask from a very liberal population, would you ever vote for Donald Trump? And you're going to get a very skewed kind of data there, and vice versa. If you go to an extremely Republican group and you ask them about voting for Kamala Harris, there might be a lot of controversy. You might not get as much variability in your response because there is a understanding that they will probably respond in a certain direction. Maybe you even ask about more societal things, such as have you ever spanked your children, which is in our generation becoming a less and less acceptable method of parenting. And so there's kind of an assumption based on which demographic you're answering. So it is a loaded question because the participant is almost assumed that they are going to answer the way that you want them to answer. And this has issues because it limits the respondent to a single answer, because they're going to answer the way that you're expecting them to. There's kind of a obvious answer there. And it could make the respondent defensive if they're from a population that maybe doesn't agree with their larger population about this controversial assumption. You do have people, subgroups of people in the population who might kind of buck the trend, in which case they'll be defensive if they think that you assume something about how they're going to respond. And of course, it's going to be biased. It can skew the data, where you represent and say, look, everybody agreed with this thing that I asked them about. Well, did they have very many options through the loaded question? It was so loaded that of course you were going to find it in the specific population. So it's not really a good representative of the entire kind of human experience. Another similar biased form of question is a leading question. This is again expecting a specific answer, but it's clearly making the participant know what you want the answer to be. So whereas a loaded question is an assumption about how the participant will want to answer, a leading question is the participant gets an assumption about how you want them to answer. So you put a leading question usually has information about it that hints at what you as the researcher want them to say. So do you think it's about time for marijuana to finally be legalized? Has significant researcher bias in it, saying it's about time, let's get it done. And the participant can read that and think, oh, I guess this person really wants me to say yes to this, so sure, I'll go ahead and say yes, maybe. Or how bad of an effect do you think legalizing marijuana will have on families and children? You are suggesting there's this negative skew to the process of legalization, so the participant might respond to that assumption that you want to know that it's bad. So again, this limits the respondent because they think they have to respond in one way or another, and it could manipulate the respondent to say things that they don't naturally believe. There's also a significant amount of reactivity that could come in from a leading question, where somebody who didn't necessarily have an opinion becomes either wants to agree with you or becomes defensive about it and thinks, what do you mean finally be legalized? Is this an issue? Well, no, I'm going to now stand in the opposite direction. I'm going to react to your assumption that I'm going to agree with you, and I'm going to say exactly the opposite, even if they didn't actually believe that going into the study. So this manipulation could go the way the researcher maybe hopes it goes. I mean, not that the researcher is hoping for manipulation, but it could go in the direction they are hypothesizing, or it may skew in the opposite direction. Whatever it is, it's not accurate. So these leading and loaded questions lead to a significant amount of bias. Less about bias, but still extremely problematic in writing questions, is when you do a double-barreled question, where you ask two things at once. So, do you think that legalizing marijuana will help decrease the crime rate and lead to a happier, healthier population? Well, there's two parts that the participant could agree or disagree on in this question. And if they agree or disagree, well, which one are they agreeing to? Are they saying, yes, it could decrease crime rate, or are they saying, yes, it'll lead to happier, healthier population? Maybe they're saying yes to both or no to both. You don't know. So in these double-barreled, you don't know which part they are actually responding to, and so you can't interpret the results. They are ambiguous after that point. As a last note about things to consider when you are writing questions is to avoid negatively worded questions, where there's a negative in the statement that makes the question more challenging for the participant to read and understand what you're asking. So negatives are such as not, never, wouldn't, shouldn't. You can think about exams you've taken where it says, which of the following is not such and such. And sometimes, I believe it's happened to most students, where you forget to read the not, and so you respond in a way that is oh yeah, this is one, and it turns out that that wasn't what the question was actually asking. These nots and nevers can be very confusing. Now, researchers, and I'm guilty of being this, you saw on your exam, well, they highlight that not sometimes to make it clear that it's there. So which of these is not, underline, bold. But even then, if you really want to help out your participant in answering, you should make sure you just leave out those negations. So here's some examples of those negations. I do not believe that marijuana should not be legalized. That's kind of a double negative there, which can be really confused. Are you asking about legalization or not legalization, or the process of not undoing legalization? It's very confusing, and the participant might at the end not know how to respond. Not as bad, but still challenging, is marijuana should never be legal. Well, if you put disagree or agree, do I agree that it should never be legal? But there could be an interpretation where I disagree, so it should be legal. And just that never associated with the negation of the disagree can be very complicated for the participant to figure out what are you actually asking, or more, how do I actually want to respond to this question to share my belief. The issue is, again, confusing to participants, so that you might get inaccurate responses. It's not actually representative of the participant's beliefs. And if it's too bad, it may lead to frustration and even dropout of your study, where a participant says, I'm tired of this. It took too much mental effort. I'm too tired now to keep going in your survey. I don't want to fill it anymore. And then you've lost all the other data simply because your survey, your self-report measure was too complex and made too much of a mental drain on the participant. All right, so I've given you a bunch of ideas and things to keep in mind to avoid when you're writing a question. So here is a participation activity. Here are 4 questions that are written, and they all have problems. So I suggest here you pause, you read through each of the examples, and then you think which of the problematic things to avoid, that loaded, leading, double-barreled, or negatively phrased question, do each of these kind of suffer from. So put a pause, and then we'll go over the answer. All right, so you're back. So let's go over the first one. Please rate the extent to which you do not prefer when people do not show up on time. Well, there right out of the gate is that negative wording, that double negative about, are we asking about actually showing up on time or not showing up on time? It's a little confusing. Get this cognitive drain. Second one, please rate extent to which your employer cares for its employees and offers sufficient vacation time. Well, here the participant could respond to, I think that there's great care for employees, but I'm not so sure about the vacation time, or vice versa. But which one is the participant responding to? How do they want to respond? So here we have a double-barreled question. 2 things are being asked at the same time, and so you don't really know what you are hitting. What is the valid question that's being answered? Number 3, please rate the extent to which you value your mother, the person who endured the hardships of labor in order for you to live. Well, this is a very suggestive and very clear the bias of the researcher. So this is going to be a leading question. Remember, a leading question is when the participant can understand the researcher's bias, whereas the other one is a loaded question, which is when the researcher has an expectation about the participant's bias. So please rate the likelihood that you would help someone in need. The researcher is assuming that the individual is part of our society which values helping people in need. This is a loaded question. In addition to thinking about bias that you as a researcher might introduce into how you are writing your question, you can also think about how the respondent might be responding and thinking and going through cognitive processes responding to your questions. So one thing you should take in mind is the question order. And know that respondents are going to have a lot more cognitive ability earlier in the survey than they will as they go through, or the self-report assessment. So the amount of effort that they are going to put into interpreting your earlier questions is one thing, but also the way that they answer earlier questions can affect later questions. If they understand what you're asking about early, then they might kind of change or be reactive to later on in your self-report scale as well. So you might say at the beginning, are you in favor of legalizing heroin, crack, meth, and bath salts, which are very extreme illicit drugs? And if they say yes to that, well then later if you say, are you in favor of legalizing marijuana, you're kind of foot in the door, you got them to say yes, and so they're probably going to say yes here to what is ostensibly a less controversial drug. But the opposite could happen too, where at the beginning, if they see these very intense ones and they say, oh, absolutely no, door in the face, they say no to this, well, then later on they might feel that they have to follow through on this no to drugs and illicit drugs, or even controversial drugs. And so they might say no to the second question simply because of how strongly worded the first question was, even if internally maybe they are okay and in favor of full legalization of marijuana. So the order that you ask and the kind of degree that you ask questions can affect and create reactivity in the participant. Now, many participants come into studies trying to be good participants. They maybe are reactive, but not always knowing that they're reactive. And so they want to answer accurately, but they might be affected by some internal subconscious biases in how they're responding. And these are known as response sets, kind of mental shortcuts. One of them is acquiescence. This is where we find that participants tend to yay say. They tend to answer yes or agree without a lot of careful thought. There's this kind of push towards, I just want to say yes and get it over with. Even if they want to be accurate, there's just a predisposition towards that yay and agree. And so we can get around this by switching up the valence of our questions, switching where the yes and the agree is simply on the page. So putting agree at the beginning and disagree at the end, and then on some questions switching it up where disagree is at the beginning and agree is at the end of this scale at the different anchors. By switching up that scale valence, or every once in a while carefully inserting a negatively worded question so that they have to provide some kind of cognitive effort into interpreting the question, can help to break this acquiescence. If the questions are too obvious and they get in a rhythm of saying yes and agree, it's all things that you think they're going to agree with, and so they just kind of go down the track, and then there's suddenly one question that they might not agree with, you're more likely to have them just agree with it without even realizing. So introducing some kind of cognitive effort to overcome this acquiescence is the way to do it. You also might have kind of the opposite of acquiescence. Well, I guess not the opposite because they're not saying disagree to everything, but where they're right in the middle. It's called fence sitting, where individuals aren't really willing to commit to agree or disagree. And so they might choose that one right in the middle, the neither agree nor disagree, or a 3 out of 5 on the scale, or a maybe. Yes, no, maybe. They'll just sit there right on the maybe. This is so, again, they don't have to commit. If it's something they don't have a strong opinion about, they don't want to skew the data in any way, participants are trying to be good participants. But if you really want an opinion, sometimes it's fine, but if you really want an opinion, even the slightest skew in one direction, then what you need to do is make the scale points even number. So I gave the example that you, on a 5-point scale, they put a 3, right? 1 and 2 are at low end, 4 and 5 are at the top end, 3 is right there in the middle. Well, don't give them a middle. If it's a 6-point scale, then they have to decide between that 3 and the 4-point right in the middle. So the choice, there's no 3.5 on a 6-point scale. So that forcing them to not be able to choose the midpoint, to not have a directly in the middle fence to sit on, that will force them to skew. The final point about how to write these questions is to always consider social desirability. This is that participants always have some internal subconscious concern about the impression that their responses can convey. So there can be times when people are more concerned about looking good than actually being accurate. There is a human bias to not want to say things that their audience is going to outright reject or judge them over. Now, certainly people have different levels of social desirability. In fact, there's an entire social desirability scale out there, so you can assess how likely is a participant to respond the way they think I want them to respond versus honestly responding. So we have to be very careful in how we write our questions, that they don't convey actively through this loaded question or a leading question what we think the participant should answer. I have a funny example here about a chicken surveying and asking this loaded question about dying and becoming a chicken nugget. So this social desirability can exist in any form of self-report. Even if it's an online survey, it's anonymous, people have a subconscious bias to try to not say things that they are maybe uncomfortable with, or know that if their friends and family were reading their responses would be uncomfortable with, so they'll affect it. But particularly in interview, in a face-to-face interaction, social desirability concerns can be very heightened. And so being careful about the topics that are raised and presenting the topics in ways that are acceptable, or it's acceptable to share any kind of viewpoint. I've kind of gone over some of these already, but the solutions to this could be assuring anonymity or confidentiality. Anonymous means that the participant is never connected to their data in any way. Nobody knows, even the researcher doesn't know how the participant responded. Confidentiality is similar, but significantly different in that the researcher does know what the participant said, it's just nobody else. So anonymous is no connection, the participant can never be traced to their responses. Confidential is the researcher can trace them, but it will never get out, it will never be shared with anybody else. So people have a certain level of privacy depending on whether it's anonymous or confidential. You could also give people a social desirability scale. I mentioned that there's ways of assessing how much concern people have over the impression that their responses might convey. I mentioned when we were talking about variability and validity that the only difference between error variance and systematic variance is really whether you measured it. So if you are measuring this other variable that is affecting the DV besides your IV, well then social desirability can become an IV. It can become an independent variable alongside your other. You can have multiple things that are affecting the dependent variable as long as you are assessing all of them. So putting the social desirability scale as a moderator or mediator into your study could be very helpful for accounting for the bias that might present in a very high controversy study. Now, throughout this section on self-report, I have kind of dropped the methods of conducting a self-report, and those two general ones are the surveys and interviews. A survey is where you have a list of questions that you are giving independently to the participant, and they complete and read through the answers and respond to them kind of on their own time. Whereas an interview is a direct interaction form of collecting the data. This doesn't necessarily have to be in face-to-face. Your kind of interview that we have in the picture here could also be over phone. It could be online through chatbots or forums, but it is a kind of give and take interview where questions are being asked one at a time. The participant is actively responding to what the researcher is presenting at that moment. So what are some advantages of either? In a survey, because you're giving it to the individual participant, means you can give it to a lot of individual participants at the same time. So you can get a really large sample size from this. You can get hundreds or thousands of people. And this is a major tool for a lot of psychological research, just trying to get as many participants as possible. Because we'll find out, and maybe you remember from your statistics class, that the more participants you have, the larger your sample size, the more likely it is that you will find an effect. Small sample sizes, there's a lot of variability and we don't really know what's happening between just the few people we've collected. But when we have a lot of people, it reduces the variability, or it doesn't reduce the variability, but it informs the variability. You can see it over a huge swath, so the variability can make a lot more sense and you can do a lot more analyses. It's also very cost effective because you don't have to take the time and the effort to share with everybody. You just ping, send it to the email, and people fill it out. It's also standardized that everybody is getting the same questions in the same order. There's no extra additive interpretation that's gone by how they're interacting with the participant. The researcher isn't going to introduce their own biases individually to different participants because everybody's getting it at the same time. So there is a standard way of looking at it that's equal across all the participants, at least as long as you've written your questions correctly. It can also be tailored to be anonymous or confidential. Again, anonymous is when nobody knows who submitted the data for a survey, whereas confidential is when the researcher knows but doesn't share it with anybody else. And it's also relatively quick to do a survey. I have done many surveys where I've collected from hundreds, if not thousands, of participants in the span of a day. So it can be really quick to get data and a lot of data. But there's maybe some things that you don't want in a survey that you do want in an interview. Maybe you don't, well, let's go into interview. So an interview's benefits are that where you got the breadth from a survey, you got lots of people, you got it quick, cost effective, you can't kind of elaborate on the questions at all. A participant is only going to respond to what you have asked in a survey, whereas in an interview, the researcher might see that the participant is struggling on a question or interpreting a question in ways that the researcher didn't expect. And so the researcher can then elaborate on the question to better get at what the researcher actually wants the participant to respond. If you are doing a survey and you're sending out this standardized questionnaire, you need to make sure it is written so well that the participant knows what they're going to respond. And if you don't write it so well, you're not going to get good data. Whereas in an interview, you have a flexibility to kind of roll with it and realize something wasn't written well, and so you can rephrase. You can also develop more rapport as a researcher with your respondent, where the respondent might want to fill out more or offer more information if they feel a positive connection to the researcher. Whereas in a survey, there's no interpersonal interaction there. And the survey participant might get bored and decide, I don't really care about this survey, I'm just going to stop it. In fact, I know as an institutional researcher that we send out surveys to UVCU students all the time, and we get a really low response rate because people just don't really want to fill out surveys. But if there was somebody actually coming and trying to interview and saying, I really care about what you think, let's talk about it, students are going to be much more, or people are going to be much more likely to actually respond to share their opinions. There's also other cues that can be incorporated into an interview. Nonverbal ways of responding, pauses, can be interesting information that the researcher can record through observational methods and kind of add to their self-report survey or their self-report interview. So there's benefits and detriments to both. The interviews are very expensive. You have to take the time and effort to do them, but the surveys maybe don't get as depth as you might want as a researcher, and you have to be very clear, a lot of upfront work in the surveys. So considering what your study is doing, what you're trying to get, do you just need kind of surface level opinions, or do you need more in-depth opinions, might determine whether you're using a survey or an interview. And if you do lean towards a survey, there's some things to keep in mind. You always want to make sure in any kind of psychological survey that you are introducing yourself as a friendly, open-minded researcher so that the participant themselves feels open and able to share their opinions. A lot of participants might be concerned that their opinions will not match the interviewer's opinions, so making sure they have a sense of trust and rapport in the interview environment is very important. You also want to keep an attitude of interest. You care about what the participant thinks. If the participant thinks they're boring the researcher or the researcher doesn't care at all, well, it's not worth their time either. This is data for the researcher. They don't necessarily want to be here. So you want to keep up that interest. Don't ask any leading or loaded questions because this can lead to defensiveness on the part of the participant. And make sure to conceal personal reactions. Never convey your own bias if you're doing an interview. You want to make sure that the questions are initially asked as they are worded. You're not adding a lot of extra so that you're keeping some level of standardization in the questions. Then, of course, there's a certain level of flexibility where you can provide extra information to help the participant answer, as long as you're making sure you're not introducing more bias or leading the participant to answer in a way that you want them to answer. And then order the interview appropriately. Make sure you're asking the questions in an order that makes sense to the participant and in order that doesn't bias the participant, asking really inflammatory questions at the beginning or something like that. So basically all of this can be boiled down to treat the participant with respect, show them that you care, and make sure you don't bias them. So that pretty much wraps up our conversation of the different things to keep in mind with observational measures as well as self-report. But before we kind of end this section, I want to talk about another form of collecting this data, and that's through archival data. We focus mostly in the moment ways of observing and collecting self-report, where the participant maybe knows or doesn't know that they're being observed or responding to a self-report at this time for this researcher. But there's plenty of data out there that is not right now, but is from the past. It's been archived. And this this existing records, this extra data that's just kind of sitting around, can be analyzed. It could be observational or physiological, like health records or self-report, personal letters, any kind of data that has been kept and represents the person's behaviors, thoughts, and feelings in any way can be analyzed, and that's an archival analysis. We could also do content analysis. This is where we take information that's just out there in the world and we look for trends and patterns in it. We can convert that graphic or textual information into numerical data for our analyses, and we can classify things that have been written, things that have been shared, different ideas and phrases into meaningful categories. This is generally done with a lot of qualitative data that's out there, reducing it to certain ideas. The most I've seen with this content analysis is so much done with like Facebook posts or Twitter feeds, trying to figure out the perspective of the individual who's making all of these posts, taking all of the images and the phrases and the posts that they're making and trying to create some kind of understanding of the individual, or just taking a whole bunch of individuals and trying to figure out the general thoughts, feelings, behaviors around a certain topic from what has been posted. So taking all that content that is very big and open-ended and has so many representations and boiling it down into these meaningful characteristics, looking for an analysis not of what is said necessarily, but the general content and feel of what is being said. All right, that was a lot of things to keep in mind about these different ways of measuring observational studies and self-report studies. So for observation, make sure you're asking those 3 questions about how obtrusive are you going to be, whether it's going to be natural, and how are you going to collect the data. You should also always be considering the reactivity of the participant and whether there's any observer bias that needs to be taken into account. And with self-report, give you a lot of suggestions on ways that we can be careful with our wording so that we avoid bias. And throughout it all, we should be thinking about our participants, how they want to answer, how they might understand a question, and how they are cared about so that they, in fact, want to answer at all. All right, that's it for this week. Next week, we're going to go on to talking about sampling and introducing more about correlations. Have a great week.